Hello, my friends. Welcome to Sleep Story, your place for the best horror stories. My name is Lennox. Put on your earphones, put your phone face down, and close your eyes. Relax and let this story take you to a world full of chills and mystery. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, please like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from? And what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax.
The house had been in the Dawson family for 3 generations, but no one ever talked about the basement. Sarah had been warned since she was a child. Never go down there, her grandmother had said. You wouldn't like what you find. Now, years later, Sarah and her husband Mark moved back into the old family home. The place had charm. Creaky floors, crooked windows, but the basement door was something else entirely. The wood was dark and splintered, the brass handle cold no matter how warm the room got. Worse still, the lock on it never seemed to stay closed. I think something's wrong with the latch, Mark said one evening as they unpacked boxes. I'll fix it tomorrow. That night, Sarah awoke to a faint creak. She turned her head. The door to the hallway was slightly ajar. "Mark?" she whispered. No reply. The air felt colder than before. She climbed out of bed and stepped quietly into the hallway. The basement door was open. "Mark?" she whispered again, a little louder. She took a few hesitant steps forward. As she reached out to close the door, she heard it, a faint whisper from the darkness below. "Sarah, come down." Her heart hammered in her chest. She slammed the door shut, locking it firmly. For the rest of the night, she sat awake, listening as the whispers scratched against the door like fingernails on wood. The following morning, Sarah barely touched her coffee. Mark noticed her pale face and restless eyes. "Rough night?" he asked. "I heard something," she muttered. From the basement, Mark chuckled, brushing her concern off. "Old houses make noise," he said. "I'll fix that latch today, promise." But hours later, Mark stood in front of the basement door, frowning. The lock was twisted and bent, as if someone had forced it open from the inside. He tightened the screws, installed a new bolt, and even wedged a chair under the doorknob for good measure. "That should hold," he muttered. That night, Sarah lay in bed, tense and alert. The house was silent, at first. Then it started again. Soft whispers drifted up from beneath the floorboards. "Sarah, Sarah, open the door." Her blood turned to ice. The whispers weren't distant anymore. They were just outside her room. The faint sound of footsteps scraped against the wood, shuffling slowly down the hall. "Mark," she hissed, shaking him awake. "Wow, what's wrong?" "Listen." They both froze. The footsteps had stopped, right outside their bedroom door. A soft knock followed. Tap, tap, tap. Mark jumped out of bed, grabbing the lamp from the nightstand. He flung the door open. Nothing was there. But just down the hall, the basement door was wide open. Cold air poured up from below, carrying a sour, metallic scent. "Stay here," Mark warned, stepping toward the stairs. "Don't go down there." Sarah whispered fiercely, "Please." But Mark was already descending into the dark. His footsteps echoed in the silence. Seconds stretched into minutes. Then Sarah heard it, a panicked shout, followed by a sickening thud. "Mark!" She ran to the top of the stairs, her heart racing. The light bulb above the steps flickered weakly. "Mark, answer me." A figure appeared at the bottom of the staircase. "Mark," she whispered. The figure didn't respond. It stepped forward, dragging one foot behind it. Its eyes reflected the dim light, cold and lifeless. "Sarah, come down." It wasn't Mark's voice. Sarah stumbled back, her breath catching in her throat. The figure at the bottom of the stairs lurched forward again, its twisted legs scraping along the floor. Its head tilted at an unnatural angle, and the voice that came from its mouth was low and distorted, a guttural parody of Mark's voice. "Sarah, come down. It's safe." "No," she whispered, voice trembling. "Where's Mark?" The figure grinned wide enough to reveal swollen gums and darkened teeth. "I am Mark." Sarah slammed the door and locked it. The chair was still wedged under the knob, but now it felt like paper against the weight pressing from the other side. The knob jiggled violently, and the whispers returned, louder now, overlapping voices tangled together. "Sarah, come down. Sarah, Sarah." Then silence. She barely slept that night. Mark's phone went unanswered. The police arrived the next morning and searched the basement. "Nobody's down there," the officer said, stepping out of the darkened stairwell. "Just a bunch of old junk and some rusted pipes. He's probably out blowing off steam." Sarah knew better. Mark would never leave without a word. That night, she locked the basement door again and dragged the heaviest dresser in front of it. Hours later, Sarah woke with a jolt. Something cold touched her hand. She bolted upright and froze. Mark's wedding ring sat on her nightstand, still slick with something dark and foul-smelling. She gasped, backing away, and that's when she heard it. From the vent beneath her bed, a voice hissed. "You should have let me in." The whispers swarmed her room like bees. Voices rose and fell, chanting her name. The walls seemed to vibrate, and the floor groaned under her weight. Shadows gathered along the corners, shapes forming out of the dark. The whispers stopped. The silence felt worse. Then, from beneath her bed, a hand shot out, pale and clawed, grasping for her ankle. Sarah screamed and bolted out of the room. She sprinted to the kitchen, yanking a knife from the drawer. The basement door stood wide open. This time, footsteps pounded up the stairs, fast and heavy. A figure appeared in the doorway, gaunt, with blackened fingers and wide, milky eyes. Its mouth stretched into an impossible grin. "You should have let me in," it whispered again. Sarah's breath came in ragged bursts as the figure advanced. The knife trembled in her grip. The thing in the doorway grinned wider, teeth jagged and dark, gums peeling back like rotted leather. "What do you want?" she shrieked. The figure tilted its head. "You," it whispered, voice like wind through dry leaves. It took another step, fingers twitching. Sarah's gaze darted to the window, too far. The back door locked. Her heart pounded like a drum. Then she noticed something. The figure's shadow twisted unnaturally, sprawling along the floor like liquid ink. It seemed to pulse, stretching toward her. As the shadow touched her toes, an icy numbness shot up her legs. "No!" she screamed, stumbling back. The shadow writhed and recoiled. The figure snarled, an animalistic, guttural sound, and lunged. Sarah swung the knife blindly. The blade tore through its arm, but no blood came. Instead, the wound hissed and smoked as if she'd cut into burning paper. The figure staggered back, howling. Sarah bolted. She sprinted down the hall and into the bathroom, slamming the door shut. She locked it, bracing her back against the wood. Her pulse roared in her ears. For a moment, Nothing. Then came the whisper, close enough to feel hot breath seeping through the crack under the door. "You can't hide." The knob rattled violently. Then silence. Sarah sat frozen, muscles aching. Minutes dragged by, stretching into an hour. Only then did she inch the door open. The house was quiet. Too quiet. The air was cold and stale. The basement door was still open, but the figure was gone. Only faint footprints, dark and wet, trailed back down the steps. Something metallic glinted on the floor. Mark's phone. Sarah snatched it up. The screen was shattered, but the last text sent made her blood turn to ice. "Don't follow me." She knew what it meant. Mark was still down there. "I'm coming for you," she whispered, gripping the knife tightly. Sarah's grip tightened around the knife as she stared at the gaping black void beyond the basement door. Cold air wafted upward, thick with a sour, metallic scent that made her gag. The dark seemed to press against her, swallowing the faint light from the hallway. But Mark's phone lay in her trembling hand, and she knew she had no choice. "I'm coming for you," she whispered again, stepping forward. The stairs creaked beneath her feet, each step groaning under her weight. The walls seemed too narrow, the air too thin. Halfway down, her breath formed small clouds in the frozen air. Something wet squelched beneath her shoe. A thick smear of dark liquid streaked along the steps. Her mind screamed at her to turn back, but she pushed on. At the bottom, the basement stretched out wider than she remembered, the far walls hidden in shadow. Cardboard boxes and rusted tools were piled carelessly in corners, but the footprints in the grime told her someone, or something, had walked through. "Mark." Her voice was barely a whisper. From the darkness, something moved. A faint shuffling sound. Then a whisper. "Sarah." Her heart hammered in her chest. "Mark, where are you?" "Sarah, come. Come closer." The voice was faint but familiar. Mark's voice. Trembling, she followed the sound toward the far wall. An old wooden shelf stood there, leaning awkwardly to one side. The whisper came from behind it. Sarah grabbed the shelf, straining to pull it away. Behind the shelf, the wall gaped open, a narrow, jagged tunnel carved into the earth. Loose soil clung to the walls, and the air smelled damp and decayed. "Mark," she called again, louder now. The voice responded, weaker this time. "Sarah, hurry, please." She knelt and crawled inside. The tunnel walls scraped her arms as she dragged herself forward. The whispers grew louder, echoing strangely. "Hurry, hurry, hurry." Ahead, a flickering light danced, a candle flame. Sarah reached it and gasped. Mark's jacket lay crumpled on the floor, but no sign of him. A rusted chain dangled from the wall, the cuff still locked around a broken wrist bone. "Oh God," she whispered. She turned and froze. A figure crouched at the tunnel's entrance, its eyes reflecting the candle's flame like dull silver coins. Its twisted grin widened, and Sarah realized with horror that it was wearing Mark's face. Pale, stretched too tight, stitched along the edges. "You found me," it whispered. The candle snuffed out. The darkness swallowed her. Sarah froze, her breath trembling in her chest. The air turned ice cold, and something shifted in the pitch black, slow, deliberate footsteps crunching in the dirt. "Mark?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. The footsteps stopped. "You shouldn't have come." The voice rasped, dry, distorted, yet chillingly close to Mark's tone. A hand, cold, skeletal, brushed against her arm. Sarah screamed and lashed out with the knife, feeling it bite into something solid. The figure hissed and stumbled back. In the flickering afterimage of the snuffed candle, she glimpsed pale, wrinkled flesh peeling from the face like damp paper. "Mark's not here anymore," the thing sneered. "But you'll stay with us." Sarah bolted down the tunnel, crawling desperately through the suffocating darkness. Dirt clung to her hands, filling her nails. The walls seemed to narrow, closing in like a clenched fist. Behind her, distorted whispers filled the tunnel, overlapping like a twisted chorus. "Sarah! Sarah! Sarah!" A cold hand grabbed her ankle. Sarah shrieked, kicking wildly. The hand tightened, nails biting into her skin. With all her strength, she drove her knife backward. The blade sank deep, and the grip loosened. She scrambled forward, crawling faster until the tunnel opened back into the basement. Panting, Sarah leapt to her feet and bolted for the stairs. Something scraped along the tunnel behind her, fast and frantic. Pale fingers curled around the edge of the opening, but she grabbed the heavy wooden shelf and shoved it back into place. A muffled snarl rose from the other side. Sarah braced her back against the shelf, forcing her weight against it. The whispers rose again, louder, angrier. The shelf groaned and shifted as something powerful slammed against it from the other side. "Please stop," Sarah whimpered. "Just stop." And suddenly, the pounding ceased. The whispers faded. The air went still. Sarah stumbled back, gripping her injured ankle. Her sock was soaked with blood. Gritting her teeth, she limped upstairs and locked the basement door. The house felt colder than before, and the air seemed thicker, heavy, almost syrupy. On the wall near the kitchen, fresh scratch marks had appeared, jagged letters carved deep into the plaster. "Let US in." Sarah sat huddled in the corner of the living room, clutching her injured ankle. The bleeding had slowed, but the dull throb pulsed in time with her heartbeat. The room seemed colder now, the walls pressing in, as though the entire house had exhaled something dark and heavy. She stared at the basement door, the fresh claw marks carved deep into the plaster beside it. "Let us in." The words seemed to hum in her mind, like an itch she couldn't scratch. Her phone lay beside her, dead. She had no way to call for help, and the nearest neighbor was nearly half a mile away. She couldn't risk leaving. She knew they were still down there, watching, waiting, whispering. The whispers started again, faint and brittle like dry leaves scraping across pavement. They seemed to coil from the cracks in the walls, seeping through the floorboards. "Sarah, Sarah, come back." "Go away," she whimpered, gripping her knife. "Just go away." Something tapped against the window, 3 slow, deliberate knocks. She twisted toward the sound, heart racing. Through the glass, a pale figure stood in the dark yard, motionless. Its face was twisted, sickly pale, its mouth split into an unnatural smile that stretched far too wide. The figure lifted one arm and pointed directly at her. "No, no, no," Sarah stammered. She grabbed a blanket from the couch and flung it over the window. The whispers swelled, rising to a feverish chant that seemed to come from all directions. "Let US in. Let US in. Let US in." The basement door rattled violently, slamming hard against its frame. Something heavy began pounding on it from the other side, something strong. The wood groaned, splintering at the edges. "Stay out," Sarah screamed. She grabbed a chair and shoved it under the doorknob, but the pounding only grew louder. "Please stop," she whimpered, tears streaking her face. The pounding stopped. Silence swallowed the room. Sarah knelt by the door, breathing hard. Minutes passed, and she dared to believe they had gone. Then came the faintest whisper, a child's voice. right against the crack of the door. Please, I'm cold. Won't you let me in? Sarah's breath caught. No, she whispered. I know what you are. The voice changed, distorting into something deeper, guttural, and wrong. Then we'll come ourselves. The lights flickered once, twice, then died altogether. From the dark, she heard footsteps, not from the basement, but from inside the house. Sarah's breath came in short, panicked bursts. The footsteps creaked closer, slow, deliberate. Something moved in the shadows near the kitchen, a distorted shape barely visible in the suffocating darkness. Who's there? She whispered, her voice shaking. The answer came as a raspy chuckle, low and ragged, like dry leaves grinding together. From the far corner, a shape emerged, no longer just a shadow. It was tall, twisted, with a face stitched tightly into an unnatural grin. And the face. Oh God, the face. It was Mark's. We told you to let us in. It crooned, its voice a mockery of her brother's. Now we're here. Sarah stumbled back, gripping the knife tightly in her trembling hands. The figure stepped closer, its limbs bending at unnatural angles, bones cracking with each distorted movement. The skin on its face stretched too tightly over the skull, Mark's eyes dull and lifeless. You're not him, Sarah screamed, slashing wildly with the knife. The blade sliced into the thing's arm, and its grin widened, thick black fluid dripping from the wound. Poor Sarah, it sneered. So scared, so alone. From behind her came another voice, smaller, fragile. Please, it's cold. Let me in. Sarah spun around, and there, standing in the hallway, was a child, pale and thin, her eyes wide and pleading. Her skin was grayish, her dress damp and clinging to her frail body. Please, just let me in. You're not real, Sarah choked, stepping back. But as she moved, the figure wearing Mark's face lunged forward, clawed fingers reaching for her. Sarah slashed again, this time slicing deep across its chest. The thing staggered back, but another voice, lower, deeper, rumbled from the basement door. We are many, and we are here. The pounding started again, this time harder. The basement door shook violently in its frame. More voices joined in, dozens, maybe hundreds, whispering, chanting her name. Sarah, Sarah, Sarah. The figure wearing Mark's face rose again, its twisted grin widening. It's time to come home, it whispered. You belong with us. The basement door burst open, the wood splintering as shadowy figures poured out. Thin, pale bodies with hollow faces. Their empty eyes glistened as they crawled across the floor toward her. Sarah screamed and bolted for the front door. The lock stuck, rusted and frozen. Cold hands seized her ankle, dragging her back. She kicked, the knife slipping from her grasp. Pale fingers clawed at her legs, pulling her closer to the gaping basement door. No, she screamed. No. Then suddenly, headlights swept across the window. Tires crunched in the driveway. A voice, loud and familiar, called her name. Sarah, Sarah, where are you? Her father's voice. The shadows recoiled, hissing as they slithered back into the basement. The figure wearing Mark's face twisted, its stitched grin contorting into a snarl before it, too, melted back into the darkness. The basement door slammed shut, the house now silent once more. The front door burst open, and her father stumbled inside, flashlight in hand. Sarah, she collapsed in his arms, sobbing. They took Mark, they took him. I know, her father whispered. I know. Sarah's father held her tightly, whispering words of comfort, but she couldn't stop trembling. The air still felt heavy, saturated with the foul presence of whatever had been in the basement. "Dad," she rasped. "They took Mark." Her father's face darkened. "I know," he said again, his voice grim. "But we can't stay here. Come on." Together they stumbled outside, Sarah limping with her injured ankle. The cold air stung her face, but the night felt strangely still. No crickets, no wind, just silence. Her father's truck sat in the driveway, headlights still on. "We have to go back for him," Sarah blurted. "We can't leave him down there." Her father's face twisted in grief. "Sarah, your brother's gone. He's been gone for weeks." "No," she insisted. "He's still in there. I heard him. I know it was him." "It wasn't him," her father said firmly. "Whatever's down there, it's been mimicking him. The same thing happened to your uncle years ago. The voices, they trick you." Sarah shook her head. "I know what I heard. I know it was him." Her father stared at her for a long moment before finally sighing. "I never wanted you to know this, but there's something you need to see." They returned to the truck, and her father drove a short way down the road before turning onto a narrow dirt path that disappeared into the trees. After a few minutes, he parked in front of a sagging wooden shack. "This is where it started," he muttered. The shack smelled like mildew and rot. Inside, the floor was littered with papers, journals, and yellowed photographs. Sarah knelt to examine one, a photo of her father, barely a teenager, standing beside his older brother, her uncle. "Uncle Joe," she murmured. She remembered him faintly, always quiet, a shadow of a man. "That thing took him," her father said, voice breaking. "When I was your age. He never really came back." He handed her an old notebook, pages brittle and crinkled. Inside were scrawled descriptions, twisted faces, whispers from the walls, and "The voices," Sarah whispered. "It's the same thing. The same whispers." "I tried to stop it," her father said. "I sealed the basement door. I thought it was enough. But when Mark went missing, I knew it had started again." "We can still save him," Sarah pleaded. "I know he's in there." Her father's face was hard with doubt, but finally, he gave a slow nod. "If we're going back in, we have to finish this, once and for all." They returned to the house, the darkness inside seeming thicker than before. The basement door stood slightly ajar, and a faint voice, Mark's voice, echoed from below. "Sarah, Dad, help me. Stay behind me," her father warned. He held a crowbar in one hand and a lantern in the other as they descended the creaking steps. The basement was colder than before, and the air seemed to ripple like heat waves. Shadows shifted in the corners, twitching and writhing. "Mark," Sarah called. "Help me." His voice trembled, faint and broken. They followed the sound deeper into the basement, where the shadows seemed to thicken. Something moved behind the old shelves, a figure, Mark, pale and thin, his face streaked with dirt. "Mark," Sarah cried, rushing forward. "No," her father barked, grabbing her arm. From the dark behind Mark's shape, something massive unfolded, a grotesque mass of limbs and empty faces, hollow eyes staring from twisted, contorted skulls. Arms lashed out, dragging Mark back into the dark. "No!" Sarah screamed, clawing at the air. Her father swung the crowbar, striking one of the twisted faces. The thing recoiled, screeching in pain. "We have to burn it," her father shouted. He tossed the lantern, flames spreading rapidly across the floor. The creature thrashed and shrieked as fire consumed it. "Mark," Sarah cried, but her father dragged her away as the flames roared to life. The shadows twisted and writhed as the house groaned. They stumbled outside just as fire burst through the basement windows. Sarah's sobs racked her body as her father held her tightly. "He's gone," she whispered. "He's really gone." But as the fire raged behind them, a faint whisper curled through the night air. "Sarah, help me." The faint whisper twisted through the cold night air. "Sarah, help me." "Did you hear that?" Sarah gasped, turning toward the burning house. "He's still alive." "No," her father said weakly. "It's not him." "It is, I know it is." Sarah broke free from her father's grip and ran toward the collapsing house. Flames roared from the windows, but she refused to stop. "Mark," she screamed. "Mark, where are you?" Through the smoke, she saw movement. A figure staggering near the back door, arms flailing weakly. "Mark!" Ignoring her father's shouts, Sarah bolted forward, dodging burning debris. She reached the figure, and it was Mark. His face was pale, eyes wide with terror, but he was alive. "Come on," Sarah screamed, throwing her brother's arm over her shoulder. They stumbled back through the heat, smoke choking her lungs. Just as they reached the threshold, the ceiling groaned above them. Wood splintered and fire rained down. But their father appeared, grabbing both of them and yanking them clear just before the house fully collapsed. The three of them tumbled onto the frozen grass, coughing and gasping for air. Sarah clutched Mark tightly, tears streaming down her face. "You're okay," she whispered. "You're okay. I heard you calling me," Mark rasped, his voice hoarse. "But I couldn't find the way out. Something kept pulling me back. It's gone now," their father said, kneeling beside them. His voice was low but hopeful. I think it's finally over." For a long while, they just sat together, watching the flames die down to embers. The twisted thing from the basement, whatever it had been, was gone, devoured by the fire. Weeks later, their family moved to a new home far from the burned-out wreckage. The nightmares faded slowly, but every now and then, Sarah still thought she heard whispers late at night. But this time, the voice she heard wasn't calling her into the dark. It was just her brother's voice, whispering goodnight. Thank you for listening, and now enjoy the sounds of nature. I wish you a peaceful sleep. Good night.